Here we go. So I begin by quoting from Kingsnorth, as I often do. So philosopher Jeremy Nadler tells a different tale. Technology, he explains, the force pulling us downward, has always existed. In fact, fairly advanced technological knowledge can be traced back to the earliest civilizations. The difference between us and them was that they often chose not to use it. That's from page 234. In chapter 21, Kingsnorth discusses, quote, what René Guénon called the Age of Iron, a time of counter-initiation in which all tends towards the material and we daily sacralize the profane. It is an age in which our war against God comes out into the open. Dehumanizing technologies wrap themselves around us, enslaving us, like Lucifer, with their tantalizing promise of liberation from matter itself. That's from page 243. So as I've mentioned repeatedly, the reality of our enslavement is so difficult to discern because we are often complicit in our captivity. That said, more often than not, we are unaware of the choice we have made. Often it's a choice that we made as children and have forgotten since the decision has shaped our current trajectory so much as to be invisible. Ancient societies and the Amish today are aware of the quote unquote benefits of technology. They just have a wiser approach, realizing that for humans, there is a danger in having too much technology. Here's another quote from the book. Here in the West, we once viewed the world as, quote, the dwelling place of spirit, too. Before the religious collapse initiated by the Reformation threw us, albeit unwittingly, into a post-sacral world. Medieval Christianity placed a high value on the intellect, but it was an intellect that was to operate within certain bounds. Nadler believes there can be said to be two types of knowledge, that known by the ratio and that known by the nous. The ratio is the deductive, logical reasoning mind. The nous is what Eastern Orthodox Christianity still refers to as the heart mind. It is a deeper level of thinking than mere reason, and it looks to attain wisdom, knowledge of the deeper truth of reality. It's from page 235. One of the great challenges with discussing spiritual things is that we moderns have been raised in a world that lacks a living tradition of wisdom and spiritual life. Because we lack this tradition of spiritual experience, we also lack the capacity to properly understand the spiritual concepts and language that we have inherited from the ancient world. If Ian McGilchrist is correct and we live in a world created and dominated by our brain's left hemisphere, and his life's work has attempted to scientifically prove this, then seeking a path back to a balanced understanding of the world is the only path forward. Nadler's distinction between ratio and nous helps to identify one of the many things, arguably the most important thing, that our rationalistic world has lost, a connection to the spiritual center of our being, the nous. This brings us to our last quote from chapter 21. Quote, the crisis of the modern world is not a crisis of technology or politics or greenhouse gases. It is a spiritual war. What the machine represents is our ultimate rebellion against nature, against reality itself. We have seen this rebellion before. Now our culture's rejection of its spiritual core has opened us up to powers and principalities that we have no idea how to manage or even understand. And that's from page 243. This arguably is the central thesis of Kingsnorth's book. The modern world's problems are spiritual, not historical or material. Kingsnorth has taken the time in the earlier chapters of the book to provide the many data points that have led him to his ultimate conclusion. As I mentioned above, this is a difficult pill to swallow for us modern folk who have been raised largely without any real connection to a living tradition of wisdom and spiritual understanding. This was, in fact, Kingsnorth's experience. As a young person, he rejected a Christianity that he no longer viewed as relevant and vital, and searched in vain in Eastern religions and paganism until he finally found a Christian tradition that has retained a living connection to the nous, in a spiritual tradition that cultivates this connection. That said, and then I end this section with one last quote. I learned from that experience on the holy mountain of Athos that my belief in the profanity of technology is not widely shared. While there have been astute religious critics of the machine, Wendell Berry, Ivan Illich, Jacques Ellul, and Philip Sherrard have all made appearances in this book. It appears that many spiritual leaders and thinkers are as swept up in the machine's propaganda system as anyone else. They have bought into what we might call the myth of neutral technology, a subset of the myth of progress. I find it hard to understand how true faith can coexist with either, but I think, as ever, I am in the minority here. That is from page 246. And that is, hello, Jen. Good to see you. So, yeah, so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. The best possible spin that I have, and I'd love to talk to him about his experiences on Mount Athos. The best possible spin that I can offer theologically is that because of Orthodoxy's focus on free will, the church historically has not said too much about these kind of things that are outside of the liturgical and immediately like ethical, spiritual world. Of course, they very much bleed into the spiritual and ethical world and the liturgical world even. So that's a big question. My blog post for tomorrow for Protecting the Veil, I probably go into it more deeply in more kind of theological depth than in today's blog post. But it does seem like there should be some guidance. And there's a book by Jean-Claude Larcher called The New Media Epidemic. So there have been some writers who've written about it. But it is, it seems like there's almost no bigger existential threat to humanity generally and to Orthodox Christian spiritual life more specifically. But maybe, maybe I'm out to lunch. I'm totally happy to accept that if that's the truth. It does seem like it's a really serious thing, however. Hello, Chris. Less news, more news. Less news, more news. Yeah, amen. So anyway, if you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them. I'm going to go on to chapter 21. Again, there's a link to the blog post if you want to follow along in the description under the video. So in chapter 22, Kingsnorth continues to develop his argument for where he believes we are headed spiritually. He's particularly concerned that there appears to be precious little critical thinking being done by those who have traditionally protected and handed down wisdom, religious folk. Kingsnorth is not alone in this lament. Philip Sherrard wrote about the same concern 30 years previously in his article, The Desert Fathers and Ourselves. I share their concern and their lament. And yeah, I speak more about this in the blog post that I'm releasing tomorrow for Protecting the Veil, and a little bit more about Philip Sherrard. But I wrote a paper and presented a paper this past summer at a conference on Sherrard, and in particular his article, The Desert Fathers and Ourselves, which was his kind of a love letter. I describe it as a love letter from a jilted lover. It was published after Sherrard's repose. I think that was intentional, so he didn't have to maybe deal with any blowback, and it could just be kind of his final words. And I think he was a prophetic voice. Kingsnorth has referred to him a number of times. It was Sherrard's book that really stoked my concern and interest in these questions back soon after I became Orthodox, long ago. Kingsnorth's suggestion that, quote, they have bought into what we might call the myth of neutral technology is worth looking at more closely. Most people do not think about these kind of questions very much, but when they do, they usually end up focusing on the benefits of a particular technology and their ability to retain their freedom to use or not use any given technology. If one thinks about this for very long and is honest with oneself, it becomes clear that in most cases, technology is not, in fact, neutral. Why is this? Neutrality as a concept is generally a myth, but it is particularly a myth when it comes to technology. Neutrality suggests that something can exist in a state where it does not exert any influence or coercion over the things and people surrounding it. Technology is not neutral because it is inherently formative. Among other things, 1, it restructures the field of human action. 2, it shapes perception before it shapes behavior. 3, it embodies values and assumptions about the human person. 4, scale, speed, and automation dissolve moral proportionality. 5, it creates new necessities, not just new possibilities. 6, it reorders time itself. 7, it forms habits, not just actions. 8, it forms systems, not isolated artifacts. I plan to write about this myth in greater detail as it deserves an installment all on its own, so please stay tuned. The following account from Kingsnorth's book offers remarkable insight into how digital technology forms humans. It's particularly valuable because it was written decades ago by one of the first people to spend much of his life in front of a computer. It can be more difficult for us, having grown up with screens, to have the kind of sensitivity that the writer, David Black, had. And here is a quote from Kingsnorth's book. Even in the mid-1980s, Black had noticed how hours spent on a computer were changing him. And then he quotes Black, quote, "I noticed that my thinking became more refined and exact," he wrote. "I was able to carry out logical analyses with facility, but at the same time, more superficial and less tolerant of ambiguity or conflicting points of view," end quote. Then back to Kingsnorth. He might as well have been taking a bet on the state of discourse in the 2020s. More significantly, though, he felt as if the computer were somehow drawing him in and draining him of power like a battery. Back to Black, quote, "I developed a tremendous capacity for application to the solution of problems connected with the computer, an ability for sustained intellectual concentration far above average," he explained. "So long as the focus of concentration was the computer. In other areas, I lost willpower, and what I had took on an obsessive character," end quote. Back to Kingsnorth. Long before the web, the computer was already molding people into a new shape. From a Steinerian perspective, these machines, said Black, represented the vanguard of Ahriman's manifestation. Ahriman is this entity, spiritual entity that Steiner had talked about. As he puts it, quote, "With the advent of the first computer, the autonomous will of Ahriman first appears on Earth in an independent physical embodiment. The appearance of electricity as an independent freestanding phenomenon may be regarded as the beginning of the substantial body of Ahriman, while the computer is the formal or functional body," end quotes from page 258. Fiction often precedes reality. Much of the modern world can be seen predicted in 20th century science fiction. And it's remarkable to find a kind of prophecy of these things in C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, the film The Matrix, among others. In the Screwtape Letters, C.S. Lewis references a sense in which, on the spiritual plane, and in a diabolical inversion of our relationship with God, the energy of a weaker being might be absorbed by a stronger being. Similarly, at the heart of The Lord of the Rings is the idea that Sauron absorbs weaker beings. And finally, a key conceit in The Matrix is that humans are being used by machines as batteries. Here's another quote from the book. To Ian McGilchrist, the Western way of seeing, a way of seeing that was always going to give birth to something like the machine, is rooted in the brain itself, and our very particular way of relating to the world can be seen from some angles as almost a form of mental illness. It's from page 266. The title of part 4 of the book is The Savage Reservation, which is a reference to the fenced-off area in New Mexico at the end of Brave New World, where people live according to primitive or traditional ways of life that the world state has deemed obsolete. It is the place that one goes if one wants to live a real life outside of the Brave New World. Again, fiction often precedes reality. And come back here. I don't know if anyone had anything they wanted to say. Nope. Okay. All right. Well, let's continue then. Again, any thoughts or questions, please don't be shy. In chapter 23, the first chapter of part 4, Kingsnorth makes one of his most provocative statements. It is entitled, "The West Must Die." As I mentioned before, one of the great strengths of Kingsnorth's book is that he helps one get properly reoriented in a world that has been turned upside down. I find his diagnosis difficult to refute, and so his cure would appear to be inevitable, though it's a bitter pill to swallow. And a quote that kind of the sense of a number of people's quotes that I've come across recently. He's too extreme, Kingsnorth. Things aren't that bad and will eventually get better. This is the kind of response to Kingsnorth's book that I have encountered numerous times recently. I'm an eternal optimist, and I'd certainly prefer it if Kingsnorth is wrong. Unfortunately, I think he is correct, and it is likely that the coming years will increasingly prove him and those upon whose shoulders he stands to be so. It's another quote from the book. Forget then about defending the West, quote unquote. Think instead about rebuilding a real human culture from the roots. If we have gone down a blind alley, then we need to back up, to turn around and discover where we went wrong. We need a counter-revolution, a restoration. We need to overthrow the emissary and put the real master back in its place. If we refuse to see the world or its inhabitants as machines, if we are suspicious of rationalizations and dogmatic insistence and easy answers and false divisions, even for a moment, then we are making a start. It's from pages 270 to 271. As Kingsnorth winds down the book, he returns to some of the optimism, such as it is, from earlier in the book. There is a path forward. We do have agency. As the cancer patient who has accepted the reality of their situation and the plan of treatment, so must we recognize the reality of our diagnosis and accept the bitter treatment plan. Personally, I have found that it is easier once one accepts this reality to make the necessary changes. Continued accommodation to the status quo is no longer an option. At best, we have been treading water, but we're being pulled further out to sea. And that's it for my my post this week, which came out earlier today. Like I said at the beginning, there'll be one more live stream, actually two more. We'll do one on Monday, which will be the reflections on tomorrow's post on the Protecting Veil Substack. And then next Thursday, which will be the completion of the chapter by chapter book study. Audrey posted a quote from the book. This is what we do. Here in the West, we break things, we break systems and traditions, cultures and forests. We split atoms and bust through the upper atmosphere. We break the bonds between species and sexes. We blur the lines between life and death. Our great revolution has unleashed untold energy and created miracles, but now we can see where it is going. Yeah, from chapter 23. Yes. Yes. Well, I try not to be too apocalyptic as a general rule, but it is hard not to see apocalyptic aspects to what has been going on it's been going on under our noses, for hundreds of years. Certainly, the splitting of the atom was a huge event. The first thing, as Neil Postman mentions, that really got the ball rolling was the telegraph. Electricity was used for the first time to connect the world. And that process of moving information around has only obviously accelerated incredibly. And we are on the verge of technological advances that no one understands, and that have the potential to totally reshape everything that we know to be true on the physical plane. So happily, that's not the end of the story. But if it's not the end of the world, at least these are apocalyptic times where things are being revealed. And it's good not to be overwhelmed by the specter of that, but it is good to be aware. And to my mind, it's good to make changes and to live in such a way that is more resonant and more in accord with one's deepest convictions, and to recognize that we have been living in a world that we didn't choose, and in ways that we wouldn't necessarily have chosen, and that we do have agency, but it does require different choices. What was the title of the Jean-Claude Larcher book you mentioned? The New Media Epidemic, I think it's called. Yeah, The New Media Epidemic, I believe. I think it's published by Jordanville Seminary, Holy Trinity Seminary Press, I think. Very interesting. Thank you, Herman. I'm old enough to remember pre-computer times. I kind of am as well. Not quite. I think they were definitely in the ether, and I remember as a young person excitedly receiving our first computer, the Commodore 64. We had a Pong, and we never had an Atari, but eventually we had a Nintendo. So yeah, screens and the computer world. There's a show called The Whiz Kids about a band of clever kid hackers who helped solve mysteries, and I was very inspired by that as a young person. So yeah, this is the water that most of us have been swimming in for a very long time. So be of good cheer. Christ has overcome the world. So thank you, as always. I'm glad I was able to actually connect with you. I'm sorry again for the text box mix-up last time, comment box. I simply, they weren't coming into my box, so I didn't see them. So I'm glad we were able to go back and forth a bit. Enjoy the end of the book. And yeah, if you're local, again, let me know. And if you'd like to join us for our Paul Kingsnorth after party, which will happen here locally in the next few weeks. So have a good weekend.